Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society and the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. Our speaker today is Ed Zimmer. Ed is a native of Omaha. He has an undergraduate degree in art history and sociology from Lindenwood College in St. Charles, Missouri. He lived in Boston for 11 years and was a freelance architectural historian. And he worked on projects for Smithsonian and the Museum of American History. While in Boston, he received a PhD at Boston University in architectural history. And then in 1985, he returned to Nebraska and became and still is the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Planner. Ed's talk today is on more forgotten figures. This is a continuation of the program that we had last month. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
Hopefully, if I do these right, they become less forgotten figures, both qualitatively and quantitatively, but we'll have to see how that goes. And this again will draw on the Placemakers of Nebraska, the architects, the website that the Historical Society sponsors, and Dave Murphy's the innovator of this and the senior editor, and allows me to contribute as well, for which I am grateful, along with Lynn Meyer of Omaha and others. And I'm mostly going to concentrate today on the family Tyler in various branches. But there's more than one, so I can still call it figures plural. And they may not be totally forgotten, but I think they did more work than I thought, and they are more complicated than I understood. And so by the end, the learning goals will be to show you they did a lot of work, and we can figure out who was who at various times. We'll see if we achieve that. And we begin with James Tyler, English-born, comes to America in the 1870s, is doing work in St. Louis, and then is the master mechanic for the post office courthouse in Omaha in the early 1870s, and then comes to Lincoln with the post office construction here in the 1870s, a project that drew several builders and architects to the community. In England, apparently he was a stonemason and stone carver, so I don't know that he had directly architectural training, but many architects didn't directly have architectural training at the time. And he was a swell-looking fellow with great whiskers, and it becomes a tradition in the family, at least for one generation. So I start with the post office and courthouse, what we would call Old City Hall at 9th and O, and that's the project that draws him to town. It's already underway. Designed by the federal architect of the Treasury, A.B. Mullett, and then it transfers over to William Potter before the building is completed, and combines the two styles of those architects, kind of French Second Empire and High Victorian Gothic, in one building. But this view also points us right towards the State Block, or the First National Bank building at the corner of 10th and O, which is credited to Tyler, but I wonder if that is erroneous, in that the date stone up on that building, barely visible, but it's there on the O Street front, says 1874, which is when he's still in Omaha. Maybe he's involved. Sometimes we get multiple architects credited with some of these buildings. If one designs it, another superintends the construction. But I think it's a somewhat suspect attribution. So I added a new category to the list of projects in PageMakers of disputed attributions to put these and have a chance to discuss. So this one's under disputed attributions in my mind. His early work as an architect really comes in a partnership with a man named G.A.C. Smith, who was also working on the post office courthouse. And as they finished that project, they entered into partnership together and for 3 or 4 years did quite a lot of work in Lincoln as partners. Smith goes on then and doesn't seem to have much impact and doesn't actually have many years left after he leaves Lincoln. He dies by 1886, but Tyler goes on for a long time. The Smith and Tyler projects include some major works like Mount Emerald, and this is a key connection for Tyler because John Fitzgerald, the Irish immigrant, landowner, railroad builder, labor contractor, becomes a very important client for much of the early years of Smith's practice. This was the building that sat on the 10-acre tract from A to D and 19th to what we call 20th, but what they called Fitzgerald Avenue. So he got his name not only on what becomes the subdivision right in front of First Plymouth, but he was even the street behind his house. His house faced west towards the city and the Capitol and sat on that high prominence at the top of the hill in Mount Emerald and is the first really important design that we know of by Tyler here in partnership with Smith. They're also credited, we think correctly, for the State Journal building at 9th and P, where the Journal-Star still has their offices. They were on that northeast corner of the 9th and P intersection. Most of the early accounts say it's Smith and Tyler. I have found one that says it is Winchell, the architect of the Second Capitol and of St. Paul Church, and it could again be one of those superintendent and design, but I'm confident enough that there is certainly an early contemporary frequent mention of Smith and Tyler for this building. You'll also notice I can't show you a lot of standing buildings from this period, from Smith and Tyler's hands, but we'll get to some a little bit later. And I keep anchoring on the building that brought him to Lincoln, but in this, because we have a view down 9th Street to the west to the Humphreys building, that one, that as it was built, was said to have the largest hall in Lincoln on the upper floor. So it's a commercial building below and principally a hardware store for much of its history, but apparently had a meeting hall up on the top. This is also about 1880, 1881. This would be where the graduate hotel parking garage is. And I always have to pause to go through all the names in my mind to get to the graduate for that building. They get some school work, Tyler and Smith, and design what would later be called Bancroft, but was mostly referred to simply as the 9th and T Street School, sat up north of the university campus until Bancroft is built east of the university campus and moves this one over. This building was later used by the predecessors to the Hill Salvage Company, Northwest Metals Company. And when we talk about environmental concerns and the lawns in North Bottoms, it was the lead smelting that was done in this building after the students had moved on from it. The Raymond House, which sat at 1642R, so this would be on the site of a couple of the sororities on the corner of what's I think called University Terrace, on the northwest corner of 17th and R, but a high kind of stick-style house that they're designing with a lovely, presumably slate roof with patterned slates to further enrich the design. Or a little bit better known maybe, the C.C. Burr House, because this one stayed a long time. This was the one that the Shrine Bowl operated from eventually, that sat just east of the Shrine Temple on, this would have been the 16th Street side of the block on L Street. And suffered a fire early on, then was used as office for many years. But Burr had been the mayor of Lincoln. He was an attorney, and we'll get to the Burr Block, which will be a project of Tyler as well a little bit later on. They also get the commission for Park School, one of the earliest of the school buildings, sitting on one of the original blocks dedicated in the 1867 plat of Lincoln to Lincoln Public Schools. Park School still operates on that site, but obviously in a later building. This one had a very damaging fire in the late 19-teens and was rebuilt in the 1920s by Davis and Wilson to the core of the current building. Giving a talk next week on where the schools got their names. And that one I think will be a boring part of the talk, Park School. We're starting now to move from Tyler leaves town, or Smith leaves town. Tyler continues to practice alone through the mid to late 1880s into the early 1890s. Takes on his son, James Tyler Jr., as a draftsman partway through that period, who will later become his partner. But this would be the period when James Tyler be operating in his own name as principal to his own firm. And in 1884, they get the city commission to build the engine house. I think the police station was also in here on the corner of what was the original Haymarket Square, the block from 9th to 10th, north of Q Street, where municipal buildings stood for many, many years after that. This was the first one, though, standing on a block that also had a hay scale on it. So it truly was a Haymarket Square. This is the building at the northwest corner of that intersection of 10th and Q. I think this is, if I understand the building correctly, it faced north into the block. Now, they didn't build everything in this view, but they did build several things, and we're on the old viaduct, the 1890s viaduct, looking east into downtown Lincoln, and just over the trolley cars, top of the trolley car, is a three-story building that was, we only see half of it here, but this is the best photo we have of it, was originally the St. James Hotel. St. James Hotel? That sounds like Monopoly. I think maybe this was the St. Charles Hotel. And had lots of other names along the way, but built as the Saint, I wish I could remember for sure, hotel. Right next to the Occidental Saloon, which was the saloon for the hotel and became Fringe and Tassel for many years, the costume shop. But this was a nice three-story brick building that had a single, part of the first floor was a cast iron storefront. The building is now cut down to one story, but some of the storefront remains, a few sticks of the cast iron, and this is the one place in Lincoln that I've found cast iron that is marked for the Seton and Lee Iron Works of Lincoln when they were operating in the early 1880s. On the site at 8th and Q Street where Leadbelly's is today. And we've got lots of Seton and Lee ironwork in Lincoln, but most of it is marked Atchison, Kansas, which was the home office. And I assume when they started in Lincoln, they were casting in molds that brought up from Kansas, so it still said Kansas in the mold. This one must have been a new design during the few years they operated in Lincoln. If you want to see more Lincoln, Seton, and Lee branded ironwork, go to Red Cloud, because much of the main street there in the earliest buildings is marked Seton and Lee, Lincoln, Nebraska. Not by Tyler, as far as I know. But on that same block, Tyler is credited with the 1884 Hargrave Brothers building, one of the half dozen grocery wholesalers that operated in Lincoln, in Haymarket area of Lincoln. And this sat right at the key intersection of that first overpass, because it sprang from 8th Street, not from 9th Street. So today the overpass goes by and kind of cuts this building in half visually, but originally it sat at the key entryway intersection to Lincoln for traffic coming over the viaduct from the west. So a very important placement and a handsome three-story grocery building that then confusingly has a fire in 1905, burns off the top floor, gets rebuilt as 4 stories, and to make it totally confusing, they take some of the trim from the 3rd story of the brick face of the building and put it up on the top of the 4th floor. So when you compare the photos, you can tell the building got taller, but it's like they added a new 3rd floor and put the old 3rd floor on the 4th. That building has been rehabbed just in the last couple of years and now is retail space below and condominiums above. So we still have that Tyler building still standing. And we have the descendant of this Tyler building standing, Tremont Hotel, which sat at the 8th and P intersection on the southwest corner. Should not look totally familiar, but should look vaguely familiar to you because it became part of the Granger Brothers grocery warehouses with Ferdinand Fisk warehouses built to either side of it, west and south. But it remained as part of the complex into the 1960s when Salvation Army owned it and commissioned Bill Schlabitz to build a new building for them on the corner. And he drew very much of the proportions and detail of that building, both from the Fisk building beside it, Fisk buildings to either side of it, and from the Tyler building that he was replacing. So I think we have much of the spirit of that building, and a building that fits wonderfully well into its context, especially as a 1960s building in a 19th and early 20th century setting. And then we start to get to some other buildings that really are standing to certain degrees. The John Clark Leonard House at 20th and F, late 1880s, probably the highest style Queen Anne that we have in town. If we look to the more English versions of the Queen Anne, where you have variation from stone on the 1st floor, brick on the 2nd, stucco on the 3rd, a lot of that rich ornament that we would see in American Queen Anne rendered in wood, but here kind of built into the stone, into the masonry work, as well as wooden trim added. That great conical tower and crowning roof thrusting out atop sort of a terraced site that steps up in 3 steps from the street, sidewalk, lawn, house plateau. It has additions to it to the west, but still very recognizable from Tyler's original work. And then this I'm really pleased to bring to you. This was shared by Jim Arter. The Arter family had renovated what we now call Center Stone, but what started as the Burr Block. And somewhere in the mist of antiquity, Bob Hanna had come upon this spectacular rendering of the original Burr Block, and it went on to Arter, and he shared an image of it with me. Just a wonderful, lively drawing for a very lively building. If you get way down to the details, it's just really fun work. I don't know if this is Tyler's own work. We don't see other renderings like this. We have only a few Tyler drawings, but really fun drafting as well as design of the building. And it also brings up sort of a fun question. We would refer to this, or the beginning of the building that still stands there on the corner, typically as the Burr Block. But it was L.C. Burr and C.C. Burr, 2 brothers, who built it. And on the drawing, it's called Burr's Block, plural, because it was both Burr brothers who were building it. And looking at that on this drawing, I thought, well, that isn't how it was named. That isn't what they called it. But if you go to the 1889 photo of it, a couple of years after it was built, and this we would call typically Lincoln's first skyscraper. In Chicago, we probably couldn't call a 6-story building a skyscraper, but it was about twice as tall, if not 3 times as tall as most of the buildings around it, and it had an elevator from the very start. So it had some of those skyscraper characteristics. And at the entrance, if we go all the way zooming in, where it says Burr's Block on the drawing, I think I'm in the wrong direction. it not only says Burr's block in the stone, but there's even an apostrophe. So it is plural possessive, Burr's block. I think the National Register nomination for this, which really is writing about a building rebuilt in 1915, uses as the principal name for it Burr block, but it was Burr's block and probably should be Security Mutual building, because it's the one that gets rebuilt to regain its position as the tallest building in town very, very briefly, or at least to be back in the competition. Security Mutual decides in 1915 that they need a 10-story building, not a 6-story building, but they like where they are, and they apparently like much of the style of the building, and decide to insert a taller building up through the stone walls of the original building. And on the south half, they frame up from the basement a new 10-story frame, leaving the 6 stories of stone wall standing, and then finishing them up with a perfect match of that rough texture of the Tyler exterior. There's an article published about the engineering of it and just how they were doing that, and it said they would soon commence to do exactly the same on the north half, which you can see was still standing at the 6-story height. But in the full series of photos of the rebuilding, they take it down to the ground on the north half, apparently deciding that was crazy, and build it from the ground up. But use that same stonework all the way up. I can't stand back and figure out and match, here's where the 1880s stone is and here's where the 19-teens. That pink limestone is perfectly matched, seems to me. But they carry it up really as a Chicago style, except it has the texture and exterior stone of an 1880s building, not the more sleek of something like the Terminal building of the same era. So there's what they do. Brian had his office in the old Burr's block, and if someone asks, could they rent the same space? No, because they moved the floors around when they inserted that frame through it. So spiritually, you could somewhere be near Brian's office, but you really couldn't be in Brian's space. It also tells us, I think, quite a bit about Brian, that newly arrived in Lincoln without a place even to live with his family yet, he rents an office in the biggest, tallest building in town and lives there briefly when he first comes to town. So he was establishing who he was going to be, and a couple of years later is elected to Congress, which he wouldn't have achieved, I think, at that age and that fast in Illinois. That's why he came to Nebraska. Working with the body of Tyler's work, you keep coming across Fitzgerald buildings, or Fitzgerald block, they're typically called, and that is the John Fitzgerald of the Fitzgerald House. But there were Fitzgerald blocks standing simultaneously in West Lincoln, Lincoln, and Plattsmouth, and in Lincoln maybe as many as three buildings that had been called the Fitzgerald block, because he was a very busy entrepreneurial millionaire and was just building continually and usually by Mr. Tyler. I can't illustrate them all, but this is one of those Fitzgerald blocks, illustrated here in 1889, built a couple of years before that, and says Fitzgerald block on the nameplate. This is the West Lincoln version. West Lincoln was to be an industrial town, a meatpacking town, a brickyard place, mostly owned by Mr. Fitzgerald on the west side of Lincoln, sort of up where the pharmaceutical plant is along and north of Cornhusker, west of First Street. That was West Lincoln. This sat somewhere north of Cornhusker, long gone. No evidence really of that early plat, easy to find, but clearly a quite substantial commercial building. And I think Fitzgerald's wanting to say what everybody else should come and build in his town, buying land from him. So that's the first I can show. And the second is this building at 7th and P in Haymarket. Think creamery, think the ice cream store, think Indigo Bridge. This is that site. And this is the big Fitzgerald block of the early 1890s on that site. Stands only about half a dozen years. H.P. Law rents half of it, the wholesale grocers, and Beatrice Creamery establishes their brand new incorporated business in the building in 1889, 1888, and promptly burns it down, the whole building to the ground. Big grease fire because the building was full of butter, and when it got going, it was a tremendous fire. Burned out H.P. Law, burned out Beatrice Creamery, which should have then gone out of business, and we never would have heard of them. But amazingly, they not only stayed in business, but I'll show you their building because they even stayed in Mr. Tyler's client list. But while that was being built, Tyler's brother, William, commissioned his brother to design for him another very fine Queen Anne masonry house at 8th and D. William Tyler was a building material supplier and a stone supplier. And I think both brothers are advertising their wares on this building. Very handsome. This is Bill and Myrna Wood's house. One of the other great Queen Anne houses surviving in town. Not surviving, but the site is an important one, is R.E. Moore's house, which looks a lot like and should remind us considerably of the Clark Leonard house. Has somewhat similar conical roof, although they put the chimney right up the face of it, and then put a window in the chimney. I'll show you on the next view. This sat on the corner, the northwest corner of 18th and E, meaning this is Hazel Abel Park site. This stood, R.E. Moore was a very substantial builder, investor in Lincoln, has a fabulous monument at Wyuka. Moore and his wife had daughters who died as infants, so they had no one that they were leaving their wealth to. Built a lovely monument at Wyuka and gave everything else to Lincoln General Hospital for the care of the poor. This house by World War II was a lodging place for servicemen in town, and then was taken down by the Abel family, and Alice Abel set about creating the park in memory of her mother, Hazel Abel Park. And there's a photographic view of it that doesn't quite remind us as strongly of Clark Leonard, and it sits on a more of a flat site than that beautiful terrace of Clark Leonard, but clearly closely related. And this one we know from records, while Tyler designed it, Ferdinand Fisk, newly arrived in Lincoln, was superintendent of construction on it. So we get one of those overlaps. Now we're moving towards the time in 1893, not quite there yet, but where the young draftsman in Father James Tyler's firm is going to be elevated to partner, and they will be Tyler and Son into the early 20th century. But together they'd be working on the original St. Elizabeth Hospital building down on South Street. They designed James Heaton's house on 11th and E. Heaton was a mortician in Lincoln, and this is now an office building for an agency. It was about 1891. The Lincoln Paint and Color Building on the 800 block of M Street, which has been recently rehabbed, and has, they would have designed the 3-story portion, not the 2-story annex beside it, but has that quite lovely first floor with the arched windows, and then on a very narrow little building, a really strong entry in limestone celebrating that part of the building. Also 1892, Tyler, and it's becoming now Tyler and Son, designed one of the several but now lost terrace buildings or row house buildings. They were going up in the late 1880s and early 1890s. We have 2 standing still at the 11th and H intersection, both Ferdinand Fisk designs, but at one time this at the 12th and K intersection, and this would have been on the northeast corner, 12th and K, there's a parking lot there, would have stood right across 12th Street, from Baldwin Terrace on the west side. And so you would have had another one of those little clusters of row house. This is a very handsome one built for Mrs. Lamb. Officially, in the directories and such, we get the identification as Tyler and Son, putting James Tyler Jr. into partnership about 1893. Not a great year to become a budding new architectural partner in Lincoln, because 1893 is when the panic occurs, the whole national economy tanks, Lincoln population goes down by a full third before 1900, and they're launching into their new partnership. There's a wonderful description to go with young James Jr.'s picture that in the early, about 1903, he had been appointed through much controversy as the state architect, a post he held for just a couple of years. And the Omaha Bee, which was a newspaper fairly famous for being flippant and saying outrageous things, described James Tyler Jr. as the ornamental state architect, which then the Lincoln paper said, evidently having in mind the beautiful curves of Jim Tyler's whiskers. So we had to illustrate that. And he's identified in this view as state architect, but also as Tyler and Son. That name continues through the years, the firm name continues through the years that he is state architect, which is about 2003 to about 2007. But there's a lot of disagreement in the papers of the day. There's controversy in his hiring and passing the bill to set up the office of state architect. Craddock, James Craddock, and Burlinghoff had both also wanted to be state architect at that particular time. The bill that made Tyler state architect neglected to pass an appropriation to go along with it. So his salary was identified as $2,000 a year, but he wasn't paid. And he was pledging that he would do no outside work, but he also wasn't paid. And so there is a body of work that goes on privately under the Tyler and Son name. But his father, James Tyler Sr., by the late 1890s, and coming out of that lean period of economic downturn, had become the city water commissioner. And he also pledged he would do no outside work as city water commissioner. So somebody, we don't, who was doing the outside work? Presumably they all were, because they had to keep body and soul together. But father does not seem to be in very active practice for almost 2 decades, from late 1890s almost to the end of his life in the teens, as Lincoln's water and eventually water and light commissioner. And it's an elected office. He seems to be quite appreciated by the local press, and seems to be his main occupation through much of that time was getting water and then eventually electricity to his fellow citizens. When he first ran in 1898, there was some reports in the paper that James Tyler was far too young to be the water commissioner, and then the paper supporting him reported that that was some confusion with James Tyler Sr. and James Tyler Jr., that James Tyler Jr. would be a credible water commissioner, but this was actually the father who had been building all of these buildings for a couple decades that was really running for the office and held the office then for quite a long time. Some of the work that Tyler and Son did together, with this whole mix of the public offices interspersed, began with the administration building for Lincoln Public Schools, which was also part of the high school. Sat on the high school site was the northwest corner of that block. And so we see the Artemus Roberts building in the background with the tower. This sat up against the street on the corner, about where Pershing's digital sign was for many years, was where this building in the foreground sat. And it had classrooms, but also administrative offices for Lincoln Public Schools. They also got the commission not for the building in front of you, but this is the Richards Block at 11th and O that was built by F.M. Ellis of Omaha, but burned down in the late 1890s, another one of those big fires, and was rebuilt almost immediately, but the Tyler and Son firm got the commission for the new Richards Block, which should look slightly familiar to you. It's still standing, and Dish Restaurant is on the ground floor, but in the mid-20th century it was completely refaced in limestone over the brick walls, but is still that building, and I'm told still has the timber frame of the late 1890s building within those brick and stone walls. A mid-century and more modern view of a Tyler building that structurally at least is still there, although the appearance is not at all. But after the fire back down in Haymarket of the Fitzgerald building, the Beatrice Creamery home, Beatrice comes back almost immediately and builds a two-story replacement of the whole footprint. No longer half of the building, although they're probably the same square footage that spread it out over 2 floors. And this becomes Beatrice Creamery's beginnings again in Lincoln. This is Tyler's work. So they had done the Millionaires Building and the Beatrice Creamery building. And then 2 years later, 2 more floors are added on top, 1904, just before the building permit period in Lincoln. And I can't promise that that is Tyler work on top, but it sure feels like it's built very sympathetically to the floors below. Also reflective of Beatrice's fabulous growth in the early 20th century. They're only a company months old when they burn down their building, 2 years old when they replace it with full 2 stories, and only 4 years later that they double the building. And they're soon moving on and buying the whole block down at 7th to 8th L to M and establishing a big creamery there, which stays in Lincoln after they leave this building and move to Chicago with their headquarters. Tyler's get the superintendency. They had competed for the design of the city auditorium, don't get the design commission, but do get the superintendency, and they build or superintend the construction of the city auditorium on 13th Street. They also designed the fire station for the town of Havelock, which would still be there as the Engine House Cafe without its tower, but that'd be a surviving Tyler and Son building of about 1901. In 1901, they designed a house at 1969 A Street for Roscoe Pound. We've heard of him. Well, this was his house, and this was the Tyler's design. It was a handsome little early 20th century house, and they clearly moved totally from their Queen Anne buildings of the 80s and early 90s into something more of a period revival and sort of a Dutch colonial, that big mansard roof, or maybe somewhere between Dutch colonial and shingle style. But architects get to be wherever they want. The house still standing. Then James Sr. is water commissioner in the early 20th century, and James Jr. is state architect, but and he does projects as state architect around the state, which I have fewer pictures, but also does some private work around the state, including several libraries. And the Grand Island Library in 1905 is one that then comes up in the controversy about whether he should be paid as state architect or whether he was competing with private architects for private work at the same time, which the buildings are there, so I guess he was. But he wasn't being paid by the state. But this is the Grand Island Carnegie Library of 1905 by Tyler and Son. Also 1905, back in Lincoln, they get the commission for the very handsome Elks Club building, which was 13th and P, northwest corner, which later becomes Cinema 2 and now has law office and exercise studio right across the street west of Tower Square and the Kaneko Tower. Can't quite see it in this view, but on either side of the 13th Street entrance were big elk's heads as kind of sconces coming out of the wall. They designed the Havelock Carnegie Library in 1905, one of the 5 Carnegie-sponsored libraries, Carnegie-funded libraries, built in Lincoln and its adjacent towns in the first decade. And sadly, the one that is torn down, along with the one downtown. But this was Tyler and Son out in Havelock, where they'd successfully built the other municipal building, the fire station. Then we get into the complicated period of early 20th century, 1907 to 1915. The name we find is Tyler and Brandt. Eugene Brandt had been a draftsman in the Tyler and Son office. He had been the assistant state architect when James Tyler Jr. was the state architect. He apparently could be paid through the expense account, not through the salary account, so he maybe was better positioned during some of that period. Most of the office was related to James Tyler Jr. as well during that period. But Tyler and Brandt becomes the new name of the firm. That is not Tyler Sr., that's Tyler Jr. And Tyler and Brandt were brothers-in-law by virtue that they were married to sisters. James Tyler marrying one of the, I think it was Palmer sisters in the 1890s, and then Brandt marrying her sister over a decade later, the early 20th century. So Tyler's in the firm, or Brandt is in the firm as draftsman and then becomes partner before he's the brother-in-law, then becomes the brother-in-law. So 1907, these guys get so complicated. 1907 to 1915, Tyler and Brandt, they do a lot of work. And now we're starting to get into a period when quite a bit of their work is standing. So in the Mount Emerald section, built on the site of the old Fitzgerald mansion, at the northeast corner of 19th and C, we have the Farrell House. They got more corner positions for their buildings, their residential buildings in this period, I think, than anybody else, and those were prime sites. So this fine house with neoclassical column porch, some beautiful stained glass work in this, including a mallard rising off the pond in the dining room. Farrell was a real estate developer, built lots of houses around Lincoln. 1908, they do the Ryans House on Ryans Avenue. That becomes the Hartley Burr Alexander House, and as such is listed on the National Register. 1908 at 1825 Ryans. They get the Fairbury Carnegie Library Commission in 1909, and we see a lot of their work now appearing throughout the state, and probably part of the product of James Jr. having been state architect and working more broadly around the state. The Shin Lightning Rod Building, which you might not recognize as that, but if you think J.C.'s Spook House for many, many years, but now back again as the Shin Building and offering some nice apartments downtown on North 16th Street, just half a block above O on the east side. So it faces the Federal Building. One of the sad losses would be this mortuary building from 1317 N Street downtown, built in 1909 with a beautiful terracotta facade. Wasn't torn down until 1975. Now I sound like Jim McKee, it's a parking lot. Another corner house at 17th and E, 1700 E, 1909. And this was George Haskell's house, or George Beatrice Creamery Company Haskell's house. He was the young man who had founded Beatrice Creamery and built it up through its kind of explosive growth in the early 20th century, then died a rather young man, and others, including William Ferguson, were CEOs, and some descendants, cousins of Haskell were as well. A very handsome house with rough brick front porch railing and a nice Tudor treatment above by Tyler and Brandt in 1909. 1910, they're building, they didn't seem to do a whole lot of church work. We saw a few schools early on, and there were a few churches in their body of practice, but not a lot. This was kind of combination church and school, because literally the German Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Church and School. And this congregation was so education-oriented, they essentially built a schoolhouse and operated it also as their church. At some early times, it was said that it had as many as 250 pupils, who would have been really crowded. I think if there were 2 classrooms in the basement, then that was maybe 4 classrooms of almost 60 each. A lot of children if they got that many in this little building. Later was the American Forward Society, kind of a citizenship club in South Bottoms, and now is again a church building operated by I think Zion Presbyterian, use it as an education building. The congregation also still exists right down across the street from Zesto's, so a Lincoln landmark you will know, I trust. 1910, another one of their big corner commissions, and this also in Mount Emerald, 1900 B Street, the H.O. Barber House. In this kind of misty newspaper view, we can see that it actually had a single-story sunroom porch to the south side with a railing above it, but as they finished, seems almost as if maybe when they finished construction, they had completed a second-story sunroom as well, in the same brick, it feels like, of the original building, at least a very early change in closing that second story. Remarkable design for a corner house with 2 street frontages, that the entrance does not face either one of them. It has no principal entrance towards B or 19th, but rather takes its principal entrance to the east off a little side yard with a wonderful kind of little secluded approach to that door, and then a fabulous stair tower projecting out as a polygonal bay beside it with lovely stained glass all the way up that stair tower. This later became Brown Palace, a student co-op building, and was in quite threatened condition in the late 1980s, early 90s or so, and the Sutter family and Laurie Sutter have put it back in spectacular condition. It was the star of the Near South tour of homes on a recent iteration of that biennial tour. The Tyler and Brandt firm got the job to add 2 more stories to the Sam Lawrence Hotel, and then later, this was 1911, and then a couple years later came back and added the portico that stood out on the P Street sidewalk. Much of this had been changed and didn't look like too much when it finally came down for a parking lot that became the Embassy Suites. This would be sitting where the entrance to Embassy Suites Hotel is. Continued building in Mount Emerald, the Hewitt House of 1912 at 1929 C, fascinating asymmetrical facade that sort of reads symmetrically until you look at it closely, and it's not at all, but beautifully balanced front. In Seward, they get not only a library commission, but an attached YMCA at the same project, early teens. And then in 1913 to 15, commissioned for the Noriana Apartments, beautiful apartment building, again on a corner, again in buff brick, that Bill and Myrna Wood own, right across the street from McPhee School, and has a very handsome entryway with lots of marble trim and then stained glass on the center stairs. And this is a time when a lot of the apartments being built in town were very small efficiencies, fold-out Murphy beds, very small units. These were basically units the size of small bungalows. and had living room, dining room, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and even a front porch for each one. So these were quite grand units and are still lovely today. And this is an early newspaper publication of a rendering for it. And then finally, who were Tyler, Brandt, and Tyler then? And that was Junior, brother-in-law, and Papa. In the very last years of both Brandt and Tyler Sr.'s lives, they are back in a firm together. And we have a few buildings of that era, including the George Fall Jr. house at 2401 Ryans, another corner property that was in very sad condition for many years and then has recently been renewed and looks grand again. Very unusual, very unique house in town with that grand stair up to exterior curved stairs up to a second level. Fall was a cousin of Gertrude Marquette McAfee, who was building at the same time at 18th and C, but she was using a Chicago architect, Paul V. Hyland, and they were using local talent. Her nephew was using local talent. Just a great house. And then just a couple more. We now are in a period where they're operating as Tyler, Brandt, and Tyler, but only one of them is still alive, and that was Tyler Jr. He designs the Mount Zion Baptist Church at 12th and F for the second oldest African American congregation in town. It had been a basement church, which they add the kind of mission revival stuccoed building above it in 1922, and still stands, although the congregation still exists, but they're up on North 56th Street. And one of his last buildings, I'll do just one more after this, the Senator Apartment Building, just across the street from the Capitol, is 1927, and Tyler Jr.'s work. He finally starts listing just in his own name alone. And then my last one, the Dema Produce Building, or St. Louis Gift and Thrift, which had been all covered over with a disguising screen, and then was renovated a few years ago back to its beautiful glazed brick facade in white and black. The storefront portion around the center entrance is the shop. To either side, the little low wings originally were driveways. They now have been covered over and are within the same kind of roof plan. But imagine driving your produce truck in the left side and around the back, and presumably you could come back out the right side. That was the original layout plan. They'd have to be smaller produce trucks. Smart cars would still comfortably do that, except that they have enclosed them entirely. But that is James Tyler's work late on. He lives on, young Tyler, to 1960. I don't find much work by him. If it's there, I just haven't found it yet. But I don't find work by him of any magnitude after about 1928 or 9. He's lost both his father partner and his brother-in-law, and had operated about a decade without them. But I just don't find much work. We know where he lived. He remodels a house on South 16th Street, but we've seen, I think, a considerable body of work, but he seems a forgotten figure a couple decades before he dies in 1960. And with that, I'll leave you. We have no independent work of Brandt, but I gave him his own page because right at the end of his life, he worked a year with A.W. Woods, and I couldn't really fit that into a Tyler and Brandt page, so he got his own page to acknowledge that part of his career. I'd put Mr. Craddock's picture on the postcard, but that's sort of in Jim McKee's style. That's a promise of future possible work, because we've got a lot more forgotten figures if you want to continue that kind of theme. With that, I will take any questions we might have today, and I'll repeat them if John reminds me to. Ann?
I just have a comment about the house that stood where the Hazel Apple Park is now.
Yes.
As an only child, my mother took lots of movies, and I went to nursery school there. So I was born in 36, so it would have been just before World War II.
So Ann Seidel is telling us that she went to nursery school in the R.E. Moore House on the site of Hazel Abel Park in the late 1930s. Just before it when the nursery school is there, before it becomes lodging for
Exactly.
soldiers.
Yes.
John,
You showed a picture of the Elks Club and said.
I
that
did
was
show a picture of the Elks
northwest
Club.
corner of 13th and P.
Yes, that is what I said.
Was that building done something to it? Because that's not I remember something more 1940s or 50s or something
I don't-
on that corner?
I don't know if there's you're asking about if there's a succession of buildings on the corner of where the Elks Club stood. There certainly is a movie building built there as Cinema 2, and then that building still stands, remodeled as an office building and now a fitness club and law office. I think it's called Fly Fitness today. And that was probably a building of the 60s or 70s. I don't know if there's one between the Elks Club and the cinema. I'd have to look on Sanborns and building permits. We'll mark that down as Ed doesn't know. Okay.
I remember this.
Does Ann remember one in between?
No, I remember the Elks Club. building.
Okay. Ann remembers the Elks Club. She probably went to nursery school there. Oral history is always much more credible when you can connect it to items in your life. And I absolutely now know that there was a nursery school in the R.E. Moore building because Ann told me and I believed her. Thank you.